Picture this. You're standing on a cliff at midnight, watching the ocean breathe, in and out. The water pulls away from the shore like a great chest exhaling, then rushes back with the urgency of inspiration. This isn't just water moving. This is the planet's pulse, a rhythm so ancient that it predates every civilization, every language, every human dream of tomorrow. The waves crash against rocks worn smooth by millions of these same moments. And in their foam, you might glimpse something extraordinary. Not just salt and sea spray, but whispers of what's yet to come. For thousands of years, humans have believed exactly that somewhere in the endless dance of rising and falling water lies a code. A message, a glimpse into destiny itself. Tonight, as the tide reaches its peak and begins its slow retreat, imagine the countless eyes that have watched this same phenomenon throughout history. Babylonian priests calculating divine will, Polynesian navigators reading the ocean like a sacred text, Greek philosophers pondering whether the sea's rhythm might mirror the rhythm of fate itself. The ancients called it many things: the breath of gods, the heartbeat of the world, the eternal clock that never stops ticking. But they all shared one profound belief, that in understanding the tides, they might understand time itself. Not just when the water would rise or fall, but when empires would flourish or crumble, when storms would rage or calm seas would bring prosperity. As you stand there in the moonlight, feeling the mist on your face and hearing the hypnotic crash of waves against stone, you're participating in humanity's oldest form of fortune-telling. The tide pools reflect stars like scattered diamonds, each one a possibility, each ripple a potential future spreading outward into the dark. But what if these shifting waters were more than a clock? What if they were a prophecy? To understand how people came to see prophecy in the waves, we must first understand the invisible forces that create this liquid clockwork. Imagine the Earth floating in space, not alone, but locked in an eternal dance with the moon, our silent partner, pulling at our oceans with gravitational fingers we cannot see. Every drop of water in every ocean feels this tug. The moon, nearly 250,000 miles away, reaches across the void to caress our seas, drawing them upward in a gentle, relentless embrace. As our planet spins, this cosmic waltz creates the rhythm we know as tides: high water, low water. The endless cycle that has marked time since the moon first took its place in our sky. But the moon isn't dancing alone. The sun, though much farther away, adds its own gravitational voice to this celestial chorus. When sun and moon align, their combined pull creates spring tides, water rising higher, falling lower, as if the ocean itself is reaching toward the heavens. When they work against each other, neap tides whisper more softly, their gentle rise and fall like the breathing of a sleeping giant. This isn't random chaos. It's precision beyond human comprehension. We can predict these movements centuries into the future with mathematical certainty. High tide at Dover Beach on July 15, 2157? We know exactly when it will occur, down to the minute. This predictability, this cosmic clockwork, is what first caught the human imagination. Think about what this meant to ancient minds encountering such perfect, predictable patterns in nature. If the ocean's rise and fall could be forecast with divine accuracy, what else might follow such hidden rhythms? If water obeyed celestial commands with such unwavering loyalty, perhaps human destiny did too. The Earth's rotation adds another layer to this aquatic symphony. As our planet spins through the moon's gravitational field, different portions of ocean experience high tide roughly every 12.5 hours. It's as if the planet is slowly turning inside an invisible mold, with water conforming to forces beyond our immediate perception. Ancient observers noticed something profound in this regularity. Unlike the chaos of weather or the unpredictability of human affairs, tides followed laws that seemed divinely ordained. They were nature's metronome, keeping perfect time with celestial mechanics that spoke of a universe operating according to higher intelligence. Yet science alone doesn't explain why. Civilizations turned to the tides as oracles. In the temple archives of ancient Babylon, priests recorded not just the movements of stars, but the rhythms of distant seas. They believed water carried messages from the gods, and those who could read its language held the keys to divine knowledge. When the Persian Gulf's tides swelled beyond normal patterns, it meant the favor of Marduk was shifting. When they retreated unusually far, preparations for famine began across the world. On islands scattered like jewels across the Pacific, Polynesian navigators developed perhaps the most sophisticated relationship with tidal prophecy ever known. These master seafarers could feel changes in wave patterns through the hulls of their vessels, reading ocean swells like we read books. They knew that certain tidal configurations foretold storms days. Before clouds appeared on the horizon, the Polynesian navigators spoke of wave shadows, disturbances in normal tidal patterns that revealed the presence of distant islands long before land came into view. But more than that, they believed these same patterns revealed the best times for fishing, for warfare, for ceremonies that would ensure their people's prosperity. The ocean wasn't just their highway. It was their library of future possibilities in ancient Greece. Philosophers like Aristotle pondered whether the moon's pull on water might also influence the humors within human bodies. If the same force that moved vast oceans could affect the smaller seas within us, then perhaps our moods, our health, our very thoughts followed tidal patterns. Greek fishermen refused to set nets during certain lunar phases, believing the fish themselves were guided by celestial tides. The Chinese developed an entire system of divination based on river tides and coastal waters. Master feng shui practitioners would observe how tidal energy moved through harbors and estuaries, using these patterns to advise emperors on everything from military campaigns to marriage arrangements. They saw water as qi, life force, flowing according to cosmic principles that governed all existence. Norse seafarers told stories of Aegir, the sea god who controlled the tides with his massive hands. Viking raids were timed not just for favorable winds, but for tides that their seers interpreted as carrying the blessing of the gods. A high tide arriving precisely at dawn meant Thor's hammer was clearing the path to victory. Unusual tidal behavior warned of supernatural dangers lurking beneath the waves. Celtic druids on the windswept coasts of Ireland and Britain developed rituals synchronized with tidal cycles. They believed that certain knowledge could only be accessed when the water reached specific heights, that the rising tide literally lifted human consciousness closer to divine wisdom. Sacred pools filled and emptied according to lunar schedules that marked the most auspicious times for prophecy and healing. In Japan, Shinto priests observed the precise timing of tides at sacred coastal shrines, interpreting variations as communications from kami, the spirits that inhabit all natural phenomena. The famous floating torii gate at Itsukushima was positioned to appear and disappear with the tides, creating a visual prayer that changed 12 times each day. These weren't primitive superstitions, but sophisticated systems that recognized pattern and meaning in the ocean's behavior. Each culture developed its own vocabulary for reading water's subtle messages, but all shared the fundamental belief that tides connected the earthly realm with cosmic forces beyond human control. And so, the tides became not just a force of nature, but a living calendar, whispering what was yet to come, long before mechanical clocks divided our days into precise hours and minutes. Coastal peoples lived by a different schedule entirely, one written in salt water and moonlight. The tide was their master timekeeper, more reliable than any sundial, more accurate than the most carefully maintained hourglass. Fishermen along the North Sea developed an intimate relationship with these aquatic schedules. They knew that certain fish fed most actively during the rising tide, when smaller prey was stirred up from the seabed. Others preferred the falling water, when currents concentrated nutrients in predictable patterns. A skilled fisherman could tell time by observing which species were biting, reading the ocean's schedule through the behavior of its creatures. But this natural clock regulated more than just fishing. In coastal villages throughout medieval Europe, births were often timed with the tides. Midwives believed that babies born on a rising tide would have lives of increasing fortune, while those born as waters receded might face more challenging destinies. Marriages were scheduled for high tide. When the couples joined, fortunes would be lifted by celestial blessing. The practice of tide waiting became central to maritime commerce. Ships' captains would arrive at ports days early, not just to load cargo, but to consult with local tide readers who could predict the optimal moments for departure. These weren't just practical considerations. Merchants genuinely believed that ships launched on favorable tides carried invisible blessings that would protect them from storms and pirates. In the great port cities of Venice, London, and Amsterdam, entire economic systems operated according to tidal schedules that extended far beyond the waterfront. Market days were planned around high tide, when the largest ships could enter harbor with exotic goods. Banking houses opened there, vaults for major transactions only when the local tide masters declared the water's energy auspicious for financial ventures. Farmers living near estuaries developed agricultural calendars synchronized with both lunar cycles and local tidal patterns. They believed that seeds planted when fresh water mixed with salt during spring tides would grow stronger, drawing power from the cosmic forces that move the sea. Harvest festivals were timed for the precise moment when autumn tides reached their seasonal peak. Even inland communities that never saw the ocean developed traditions connected to theoretical tides. They understood that the same moon pulling distant seas also influenced groundwater, river levels, and the mysterious springs that provided their drinking water. Village wells were blessed during ceremonies timed to coincide with coastal high tides, linking remote communities to the global rhythm of rising and falling water. Personal fortunes were increasingly tied to tidal timing in ways both practical and mystical. A merchant planning a crucial negotiation would consult tide tables not just to schedule meetings with sea captains, but because he believed his own persuasive powers waxed and waned with the water. A young woman hoping for love might time her appearances at market to coincide with it. Romantic influences supposedly carried on incoming tides. The development of accurate tide prediction created a new class of specialists, tide masters, who combined careful observation with ancestral knowledge, passed down through generations of coastal living. These individuals became trusted advisors to everyone from humble fishermen to powerful nobles planning military campaigns. But what happens when the tides do not behave as expected? When water rewrites history? History's most dramatic moments often turn on the smallest details, and sometimes that detail is the precise height of water at the crucial moment. Consider the fog-shrouded morning of April 14, 1809, when Napoleon's forces prepared to cross the treacherous Scheldt River during the Walcheren campaign. The emperor's meteorologists had calculated tide tables weeks in advance, planning the assault for low water when his artillery could ford the shallows safely. But the sea had other plans. An unexpected storm surge, driven by North Sea winds that no weather reader had foreseen, raised water levels 3 feet higher than predicted. Cannons that should have rolled across exposed sandbars instead sank into unexpected depths. What began as a precisely timed military maneuver became a chaotic retreat. Napoleon's forces scattered by water that refused to follow human calculations. The emperor himself later wrote in his memoirs that he had trusted too much in the mathematics of moon and tide, and too little in the greater mathematics of destiny. This defeat contributed to the weakening of French naval power that would ultimately help Britain dominate the seas throughout the 19th century, all because the ocean chose to rise when human science said it should fall centuries earlier. Viking longships had written their own chapter in the annals of tidal warfare. The Great Raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD succeeded not just because of Norse military prowess, but because their navigators had identified a rare tidal phenomenon that occurred only once every several years. A combination of spring tides and seasonal wind patterns created unusually high water that allowed their shallow draft vessels to approach the island's normally protected monastery from an unexpected direction. The Viking chronicles describe how their seers interpreted this exceptional tide as a sign from Odin that the time had come to strike at the Christian stronghold. The monks, who kept their own careful records of local tidal patterns, had never seen water reach such heights and were caught completely unprepared. The success of this raid marked the beginning of the Viking Age's most devastating period of coastal attacks, but perhaps no single tidal event changed the course of history more dramatically than the great storm surge that struck the Netherlands on November 18, 1421. The Feast of St. Elizabeth flood, as it came to be known, transformed the landscape of Northern Europe in a single night. Waters rose so far beyond any predicted tide that they permanently altered the coastline, creating new inland seas and destroying cities that had stood for centuries. Contemporary accounts describe how the surge arrived during what should have been a routine high tide, but with a force that suggested supernatural intervention. Entire communities that had scheduled their St. Elizabeth celebrations according to normal tidal timing found themselves fleeing rising water that climbed 20 feet higher than the highest tide in recorded memory. The flood reshaped not just geography, but the political balance of European maritime power in the Pacific. Polynesian oral traditions preserve the memory of a ghost tide that appeared without lunar explanation sometime in the 15th century. This massive wave system, possibly triggered by distant seismic activity, arrived at island communities during what should have been neap tide, the gentlest water of the monthly cycle. Navigators who had trusted their lives to traditional tidal knowledge found themselves battling seas that behaved according to no known pattern. The disruption was so complete that entire navigation systems had to be rebuilt from scratch. Master wayfinders whose families had guided canoes across thousands of ocean miles for generations suddenly found their inherited wisdom unreliable. The event marked a turning point in Polynesian expansion, as communities became more cautious about venturing into open ocean, uncertain whether the sea itself could still be trusted to follow celestial commands. These historical disruptions did more than just surprise their contemporaries. They elevated tides from natural phenomena to agents of fate itself. When water behaved predictably, it served as humanity's clock. But when it defied expectations, it became destiny's messenger, rewriting the future in salt spray and surged. If tides could decide the fate of empires, could they also decide the fate of individuals? In the weathered taverns of Portsmouth and Plymouth, where salt-stained men gathered to share tales between voyages, certain stories were told only in whispers. Stories of ships that vanished on perfectly calm seas, of crews who refused to sail despite perfect winds, of captains who would rather face mutiny than depart on what they called cursed water. The old salts spoke of the dead tide, that eerie moment twice each day when the water pauses between rise and fall, when the ocean seems to hold its breath. Experienced sailors would watch for these moments with superstitious dread, believing that ships departing during dead tide carried the stillness with them, their sails forever struggling to catch winds that would never quite fill properly. Captain Morrison of the merchant vessel Constance kept a journal that survived the wreck of 1847, found floating in a sealed chest off the Carolina coast. His final entries describe how his crew begged him not to depart Liverpool during an ebb tide that fell on Friday the 13th. Morrison, a practical man who trusted in navigation over superstition, ordered the moorings cast off despite his sailors' protests. The water pulls away from shore like a soul departing a corpse, his boatswain had warned. No good comes of following such a tide to sea. 3 days later, the Constance encountered storms that no weather glass had predicted, waves that seemed to rise from calm seas without warning. Morrison's last entry simply reads, "The tide that carried us out will not carry us home." Along the coasts of Ireland and Scotland, fishing communities developed elaborate rituals around tidal omens. Nets were never cast during a tide that arrived late. Water that didn't keep proper time was considered corrupted by malevolent spirits. Boats returning on an unusually high tide were met with ceremonies to cleanse them of whatever supernatural influences they might have encountered in deeper waters. The Celtic tradition of the seventh tide held particular power over maritime imaginations. 7 high tides after a sailor's death, his ghost was said to return on the water that had claimed him. Harbor masters in Galway and Cork kept careful records not just of tides and weather, but of which men had been lost at sea, marking their calendars with warnings about when supernatural visitors might arrive with the evening flood. Spanish treasure fleets developed their own complex system of tidal auguries. Captains consulted not only with tide calculators, but with priests who specialized in reading divine will through water patterns. A tide that rose in 3 distinct surges was considered blessed by the Trinity, promising safe passage and profitable trade. But water that fell in uneven stages warned of treachery among the crew or enemies waiting in distant ports. The superstition grew so elaborate that by the 16th century, Spanish naval regulations officially required tide blessing ceremonies before any major expedition. Ships' chaplains would watch the harbor water for signs of divine approval, interpreting everything from the color of foam to the behavior of seabirds riding the current as messages about the voyage's prospects. In the fog-shrouded waters around Newfoundland, fishermen told stories of phantom vessels that appeared only during spring tides, ghost ships crewed by men who had refused to respect the oceans, warnings in life, and were condemned to sail forever on the highest water. These spectral craft were said to follow living ships, their translucent sails visible only in peripheral vision, warning of storms or guiding lost vessels to safety depending on how the living crew had honored tidal traditions. The most persistent maritime superstition involved the turning tide at the moment of death. Sailors believed that souls could only depart the body when water changed from rising to falling or falling to rising, that the cosmic forces moving the ocean also governed the transition between life and whatever lay beyond. Ship's doctors would consult tide tables when tending to dying men, calculating whether their patients would find peace or struggle against an unyielding fate. These weren't merely quaint beliefs confined to uneducated seamen. Admiral Lord Nelson himself was known to time important naval engagements around favorable tidal omens, and his personal correspondence includes references to consulting the Waters Council before major decisions. The integration of superstition and strategy became so complete that distinguishing between practical seamanship and mystical practice became almost impossible. But while sailors clung to superstition, philosophers began to search for a deeper truth hidden in the water's rise and fall. In the candlelit studies of medieval monasteries and Renaissance academies, learned men bent over ancient texts and astronomical charts, seeking to decode what they believed was a grand celestial language written in water. These were not simple fishermen reading omens in foam, but scholars who approached tidal prediction as a sacred science that might unlock the deepest mysteries of existence itself. The great Islamic astronomer Al-Biruni, working in 11th century Persia, developed what he called the calculus of divine waters. He had observed that tidal patterns followed mathematical principles so precise they seemed to echo the geometric perfection he found in celestial movements. Al-Biruni theorized that if human intellect could predict tides centuries in advance, perhaps the same mathematical approach could forecast other manifestations of divine will, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the timing of plagues, even the moment when individual souls would be called to judgment. His treatise on the movements of waters and the movements of fate proposed that tidal calculations, combined with astrological observation, could create a complete system for reading God's plan for humanity. Students traveled from across the known world to study his methods, carrying his ideas into European universities where they sparked centuries of scholarly debate about whether the future could be calculated like a tide table, in the towers of medieval Oxford. The philosopher and scientist Roger Bacon became obsessed with what he termed the aquatic prophecies. Bacon had access to increasingly accurate tidal predictions, and he noticed that certain historical events seemed to cluster around specific tidal configurations. The deaths of kings, the outbreak of wars, even the spread of diseases appeared to follow patterns that correlated with unusual tidal activity. To Bacon's secret notebooks, discovered centuries after his death, contained detailed charts attempting to correlate European political upheavals with North Atlantic tidal anomalies. He believed he had identified a cosmic conspiracy in which celestial forces used ocean movements to signal their intentions to those wise enough to observe and calculate. His work influenced generations of court advisors who would consult tide tables before counseling their rulers on matters of state. The Renaissance brought new sophistication to tidal prophecy. The great astronomer Johannes Kepler, famous for discovering the laws of planetary motion, also developed complex theories about how tidal forces might influence human consciousness. In his lesser-known work, Harmonices Mundi Aquaticus, Kepler proposed that the same gravitational forces moving the oceans also created subtle pressures within human skulls, affecting the flow of what he called cerebral tides. According to Kepler's theory, human intelligence and intuition waxed and waned with the moon just as ocean waters did. He calculated that the most profound philosophical insights and prophetic visions occurred during specific tidal configurations when gravitational forces optimized the flow of mental humors. Some of history's greatest thinkers, Kepler argued, had unknowingly timed their breakthroughs to coincide with favorable cerebral tides. The Jesuit astronomers of the 17th century took tidal prophecy in yet another direction. Working from observatories in Beijing, Prague, and Rome, they developed what they called the global tide, a comprehensive system that tracked water movements on every coast simultaneously. Father Christoph Clavius, the mathematician who reformed the calendar, believed that by understanding tidal patterns worldwide, the Church could predict not just local events, but the spiritual tides affecting all humanity. Clavius theorized that just as physical tides were highest when multiple celestial bodies aligned, spiritual revelation reached its peak when global tidal forces achieved perfect synchronization. He calculated that the most significant moments in Christian history, the birth of Christ, the conversion of Constantine, the calling of the Crusades, had all occurred during rare configurations when tidal forces around the world reached harmonic resonance. These scholarly investigations created a new class of philosophical tide readers who combined rigorous mathematical calculation with mystical interpretation. They saw themselves as engaged in the highest form of natural philosophy, using human reason to decode divine communication written in the universal language of water. Their influence extended far beyond academic circles. European monarchs employed court philosophers who specialized in tidal interpretation, consulting them before making declarations of war, arranging royal marriages, or signing important treaties. The intersection of celestial mechanics and statecraft became so accepted that diplomatic negotiations often included provisions for consulting the waters before finalizing agreements. And from scholars to mystics, one question always remained: do the tides simply reflect time, or do they shape it? Today, in laboratories around the world, supercomputers calculate tidal predictions with precision that would have seemed miraculous to ancient philosophers. We can tell you exactly when high tide will occur at any location on Earth for the next 1,000 years. Our satellites track ocean movements from space. Our deep-sea sensors measure pressure changes that precede tidal shifts. And our mathematical models account for every gravitational influence from the moon's wobble to Jupiter's distant pole. Yet this technological mastery has not diminished the mystery, it has deepened it. If we can predict water's movement with such extraordinary accuracy, what else follows patterns we're only beginning to recognize? Climate scientists studying sea level rise have discovered that global warming doesn't just raise average ocean heights. It's altering the fundamental rhythm of tides themselves, creating new patterns that no ancient observer ever witnessed. The great ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, as they melt, are literally changing the Earth's rotation speed and shifting the planet's center of mass. This means that tide tables calculated for the year 2100 must account for a planet spinning slightly differently than it does today. We're witnessing something unprecedented in human history, the gradual transformation of the cosmic clockwork that has marked time since civilization began. Marine biologists have made discoveries that echo ancient beliefs about tidal influence on life itself. Coral reefs spawn according to tidal cycles combined with lunar phases, following rhythms so precise they suggest an almost supernatural coordination between celestial mechanics and biological imperative. Migratory species navigate using magnetic fields that fluctuate with tidal patterns, as if the Earth's electromagnetic pulse keeps time with the rise and fall of water. Perhaps most intriguingly, researchers studying human circadian rhythms have found evidence that our internal biological clocks may still respond to tidal frequencies inherited from our aquatic evolutionary origins. Heart rate variations, hormonal cycles, even brainwave patterns show subtle correlations with tidal timing that suggest we carry the ocean's rhythm within ourselves, that we are, in some literal sense, still tide-swept creatures pretending to live on dry land. Economists studying global markets have identified what they call tidal economics, long-term cycles in human behavior that seem to follow the same mathematical patterns governing ocean movements. Periods of expansion and contraction in everything from population growth to technological innovation appear to pulse with rhythms remarkably similar to those ancient philosophers sought in celestial waters. Could it be that human civilization itself rises and falls according to forces as predictable as the tide? Climate change is creating new forms of tidal prophecy as coastal communities face unprecedented challenges. Traditional tide knowledge accumulated over centuries is becoming unreliable as storm surge patterns change and sea levels rise unpredictably. Indigenous peoples whose ancestors navigated by reading subtle water signs now find their inherited wisdom challenged by conditions that have no historical precedent. Yet technology is also creating new possibilities for tidal prediction that approach the mystical visions of ancient seers. Artificial intelligence systems analyzing vast datasets from ocean sensors can now predict tidal anomalies days before they occur, not just the regular rise and fall, but the exceptional events that historically caught human observers by surprise. We're developing the ability to forecast the unpredictable, to calculate the incalculable. Space exploration has given us another perspective on tidal forces that would have fascinated medieval philosophers. Jupiter's moon Europa experiences tidal heating so intense it maintains liquid oceans beneath miles of ice. Saturn's moon Enceladus shoots geysers of water into space, powered by tidal friction from its parent planet's gravity. We're discovering that tides are not unique to Earth. They're a fundamental force shaping worlds throughout the cosmos. The question that captivated ancient minds has evolved but not disappeared. If tidal forces are truly universal, operating on scales from blood circulation to galactic rotation, might they connect us to patterns of existence we're only beginning to comprehend? Our expanding ability to measure and predict these forces is revealing not just how water moves, but how movement itself shapes reality at every level of existence. Perhaps the tides do not just tell us when the water will rise, but when our future will arrive. Stand with me now on that same midnight cliff where this journey began. The waves still crash against ancient rocks with the same hypnotic rhythm that has marked time since before humans ever wondered about tomorrow. But listen more carefully now. Hear how each wave carries echoes of everything we've discovered together, in the foam spreading across dark sand. You might glimpse Babylonian priests calculating divine will by moonlight. In the retreating water, see Viking longships riding supernatural tides toward distant shores. Feel the pull of gravity that connects your heartbeat to the moon's silent dance. The same force that moves vast oceans and tiny tide pools with equal, impartial precision. The ancient question remains eternally present. Does the water simply mark time's passage, or does it shape destiny itself? Tonight, with centuries of human observation and scientific understanding behind us, the answer seems both more complex and more beautifully simple than our ancestors could have imagined. We've learned that tides follow laws so precise we can predict them millennia in advance. Yet we've also discovered that these same forces operate on scales so vast, they include the slow breathing of continents, the pulse of planetary magnetic fields, the rhythm by which galaxies themselves turn through space. The more accurately we measure tidal forces, the more we realize how much they connect rather than separate, linking moon to ocean to shoreline to heartbeat. In an unbroken chain of cosmic causation, perhaps, the philosophers and mystics were right in their intuition, even if they lacked our modern understanding. The tides don't just reflect larger patterns, they participate in them. They are both clock and prophecy, both measurement and meaning, both science and mystery existing in perfect, eternal balance. The coastal peoples who timed their lives to water's rise and fall understood something essential that our technological age sometimes forgets. We are not separate from natural rhythms, but part of them. Every cell in your body carries salt water that remembers the sea. Every breath you take follows patterns established when life first emerged from tidal pools. Every dream you dream rises and falls like water responding to gravitational forces beyond conscious control. Climate change is teaching us that even the most reliable natural rhythms can shift, that patterns we've trusted for centuries may transform within decades. Yet this doesn't diminish the mystery, it deepens it. We're living through a moment when the eternal rhythm is composing new movements. When the cosmic symphony that includes tidal forces is evolving in real time. Future generations will develop their own relationship with these forces, perhaps using technologies we can barely imagine to read patterns in water, weather, and time itself. They may discover that consciousness and cosmos are connected by currents more subtle than gravity, more fundamental than electromagnetic fields. They might find that the ancient dream of reading destiny in natural phenomena was not superstition, but anticipation of truths we're still learning to recognize. But for now, in this moment between moments when the tide turns from rise to fall or fall to rise, we can simply listen. Listen to the waves carrying away everything that seems certain, bringing in possibilities that haven't yet taken shape. Listen to the eternal rhythm that connects this shoreline to every other shore. This moment to every other moment when humans have stood at the edge of vast water and wondered what tomorrow holds. The tide turns, as it always has, as it always will. In that turning, we find not answers, but something more valuable. The ongoing question that keeps us curious, keeps us humble, keeps us connected to forces larger and more mysterious than our individual concerns. Whether scientific or spiritual, mathematical or mystical, the tides remind us that we are part of something magnificent and ongoing, something that began long before we arrived and will continue long after we're gone. Close your eyes and feel the mist on your face. Hear the waves retreating into darkness, carrying with them the day's worries and tomorrow's uncertainties. Let the eternal rhythm work its ancient magic, calming your thoughts, slowing your breath, connecting you to the vast, peaceful pulse that moves through all things. The water whispers its timeless message. Rest now. Dream well. Trust in the rhythm that connects you to everything. The tide will return, as it always does, bringing new possibilities with the morning light.